Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
Let's look at Parashat Korach. We are going to be looking at Bamidbar, so Numbers chapter 18, verse 20. Again, I'm sure many of you know this Parsha. You probably remember that Korach goes up against Moshe and Aaron. He actually happens to be Moshe and Aaron's cousin, which rabbis have a very fun time with. Like, why go up against your cousin? Why not support them and be attentive to that which they've been asked to do by God. But anyway, so he goes up against them with 250 other people, and then they're swallowed up by the earth, based on how they acted and the fact that they went up against Moshe and Aaron. So I didn't want to take anything from that part of the story because, again, I think most of you know that part of the story. I thought this was a very interesting line, though, that God says to Aaron, after this whole bit with Korach. I said that I wasn't going to give you too much context, but let's just look at chapter 18 very quickly, so that you can kind of lead up into this verse. So when they're starting to build the tabernacle, one of the things, I'm actually talking about this tomorrow in the sanctuary service, the idea that the pans that were used by Korach and his men with that incense that ended up being seen as sacrificial, but not that which God had asked for. Similar almost to the way that Aaron's sons die, interestingly enough. But those pans are then used as part of the tabernacle itself. So something that was used for not good is now being used for good, which is the topic of my sermon tomorrow. So this is, hold on one second. There we go. This is the lead up here to this verse that we're going to look at. So it says, I hereby take your fellow Levites from among the Israelites. They are assigned to you in dedication to the Lord to do the work of the tent of meeting, while you and your sons shall be careful to perform your priestly duties and everything pertaining to the altar and to what is behind the curtain. I make your priesthood a service of dedication. Any outsider who encroaches shall be put to death. And then God then continues speaking to Aaron about the different kinds of sacrifices. So the first fruits, as you can see here, charge of my gifts, meaning God's gifts, sacred donations to the Israelites, that's kind of Aaron's job, the Levites' job as part of their responsibility for as part of sort of the royalty of Jews in terms of Kohanim and Leviim. Just trying to see if there's any other piece here so the first fruits of everything in their land shall be yours. Everyone of your household can eat them. Every first issue of the womb. So you've probably heard about, for humans, the idea of a firstborn male being given over in what's called Pidyon Haben. This is not actually where we talk about Pidyon Haben because we're talking about people and animals, but that is one concept that comes about based on Kohanut, based on priestly duties. And then we get here, I'll read one verse beforehand. This is not our verse, but just to lead us in. All the sacred gifts that the Israelites set aside for God, I give to you and to your sons and to the daughters that are with you as a due for all time. It shall be an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for you and for your offspring as well. And now this is our verse. Vayomer Adonai el Aharon be'artzam lo tinachal v'chelek. So, and God said to Aaron, in your land, be'artzam lo tinchal v'chelek, you shall have no chelek, you shall have no portion, no territorial share, it says here, among them, velo hiye lecha betocham, and you won't have within it, within their midst. Oh, Siri just picked up on that. Great. There will be no portion within that it says their midst here. I don't know. Betocham is like within it, within that space. Ani chelkecha v'nachalatecha betoch b'nei Yisrael. I am your portion. Ani chelkecha. I am that which you are going to get as a portion, and your share, that which you will receive amongst Bnei Israel, amongst the people of Israel. So I will get into why I thought this was a fascinating verse in just a moment, but I would love to hear if you have any questions about this verse. Again, we're looking at Numbers 18, chapter 18, verse 20. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah, Karen.
Why is he not getting a portion of territory?
Great. Why is there no portion for Aaron? Why is the territory now not going to be for him, but only God will be for him? Yeah, Denise.
So 1.5 questions. The one question is, if they're not having an inherited territorial portion, like it's sort of unexpected that someone would rise up and say, no, I want that privilege, because in a way they could be seen as losing out financially if they're not getting it, right? So it's just kind of, it's a little bit man bites dog in that sense.
Interesting.
And then the half question is because it's the previous verse, so it might be outside our purview, but I just wondered, what is a covenant of salt? I never heard of that.
Yeah, I was worried that someone might ask that. I actually don't know. Brit Melach. Let's see if it tells us on Safaria. Nope, no definitions found. Okay, I don't actually know. Let's see. A covenant of salt. This means that God made a covenant with Aaron by means of something which is wholesome and lasting and keeps other things wholesome, says Rashi. Like the covenant that was made with salt and that it will never decay. Those are lovely drashot. So maybe it just means that it's an everlasting brit, according to Rashi. Renee.
It says no territorial share or any portion. Is that two separate things that he's saying, that God is saying to Aaron that he's not going to have?
Yeah.
No territory and also no something else?
Yeah, it seems to be, right? It seems to be that the territorial share is one part of an inheritance, and then a portion in their midst seems to be something maybe more coveted or potentially something that's more everlasting than just territories, right? Because territories can be taken over, but maybe a portion in their midst is more like I'm trying to think of like a modern day term, like more like owning the land as opposed to owning the apartment building on the land, right?
Right. That's what I was thinking. Is it they can't have the house and also they can't have the land?
I believe that's what it's saying. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know what portion is being used for in terms of tinechal. Maybe it'll tell us other places that it's used here, but like an inheritance it says here. So that's dividing the land for possession. Yeah.
Okay. Just as an interesting random note,
sure.
when you buy real estate on land that's owned by indigenous people, like in Palm Springs or Hawaii, very often they have this thing, it's called fee simple or land lease. And so a lot of the real estate deals, you're just buying the unit or the house, but you don't own the land. It's a lease for like 100 years or something.
Oh, very interesting.
And then it has to revert.
That makes sense. I mean, that makes sense. That's very interesting. I know in Israel, it's a big problem in Israel because so much of the land is owned by the actual state, right? As opposed to people. And so then when you buy on that land, it becomes an issue, as we all know, whose land is it? Who lives on it? Right? Like indigenous Palestinian people who have lived on it for forever, even if they're Israeli Palestinians, right? They lived on that land before it was Israel. And so is it their land or is it the state's land? I know that in Israel that becomes a big thing. I didn't know about that in America. Elon, did you have a hand or did you just move on my screen? No? Okay. All right. I'm going to stop sharing this for 1 second just so I can get back to my source sheet. Does anybody else have any other questions or crucio? Yeah, Denise, I saw your email. You'll get an email at noon.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Let me just, Safari had changed their format here, so I'm having to find this a little bit differently. Okay. So because it was just, yeah, Joanna, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that there's this tradition of, like when you move into a home, there's various like combinations of this, but like the first thing that you bring into a home is wine, salt, and sugar. So I'm just sort of wondering if somehow like there's some kind of connection between salt and like taking possession of land and territory.
Interesting.
And I don't think, by the way, that that's necessarily a Jewish tradition. Like I've heard of various cultures doing things like that.
I've never heard of the wine, salt, and sugar. That's so interesting. Is it something that you bring into your home or people are supposed to bring to you?
The way that I learned that tradition is that you yourself, like the first thing before you bring in your books or your clothes or your boxes or whatever else, your possessions, when you walk into a new home for the first time, you walk in with wine, salt, and sugar.
Wow. I had no idea.
It's a sigilite.
It's what?
The signs, like we were talking about the other night.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Wow. Huh.
I heard of the salt and sugar. I did not hear of the wine.
Wine? I really like that. I'll have to look that up. I will tell you that when I moved into my home in Los Angeles, it was definitely not wine, salt, or sugar that came into my house first. But I think it was a couch. But salt of the earth. Yeah, Karen. I mean, I think that what they're bringing about here is that this everlasting covenant. Salt is something that is always, as Karen just said, like, number one, indigenous to a place, but you can always find it, right? It's always going to be part of a place where you live or a people. It doesn't go bad. At least that's what Rashi seems to think. Okay. So we're going to move to, can you all see that? I just did a weird thing. So can you see the source sheet? Yes. Karen is, yes. Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay,
fantastic. Thank you. So here's our verse again at the top of this source sheet here. And I want to look at the Ramban. So the thing that was most interesting to me, actually, before I start sharing, the thing that was most interesting to me about this verse was the fact that God goes beyond, I think, God's self in kind of an egotistical way, if you can say that about God, and says, don't worry, you're not going to get land, but you have me. Now, it's lovely to feel a connection to God, and I'm sure that was meaningful to Aaron. However, having land allows you to live somewhere. Having land allows you to create a family. Having land allows you to earn money and to feel established. God is not that, right? God does not, God might allow for those things, but God does not provide those things by having God in your life, right? God is not where you build your home or anything like that. So I was very, I forget who said this, but I was very taken with the fact that you seem to be missing, maybe it was Denise, you seem to be missing out on something very important by not getting this inheritance, and instead you have God at your side, right? It seems to not be a winning situation. It seems to be almost a losing situation, or at least a less than exciting situation. So we're going to look at the Ramban here. And he says, it means that you, Aaron, will not inherit a share amongst any one of the tribes of Israel. Okay, so as we know, the tribes of Israel were made up, and it seems as though Aaron now is not going to be part of those 12 tribes. Neither shall you have even a small portion in their land at all, for the cities which were given to them, the Levites, were also cities of refuge. Do you all know the concept of cities of refuge? It comes up later in the Torah. Okay. I think it's going to tell you what they are in a second. If they don't, I'll describe them. Paula knows what they are. Tyble knows what they are. Oh, thank you. This thumbs up thing is very helpful. And were used by the rest of Israel. Now, this admonition applies to the priests, and afterwards God mentioned with respect to the Levites, among the children of Israel, they shall have no inheritance, just as God had admonished the priests. And our rabbis interpreted the verse You shall have no inheritance in their land, as referring to the time when the land was divided up amongst the tribes. Neither shall you have any portion among them. That is a portion of the spoil taken from the defeated enemy. I am your portion. You eat at my table, meaning you at God's table. Does anybody have any thoughts about this? Or do you like this commentary? Do you think this is compelling? Does it answer the questions of why Aaron might want an inheritance with God as opposed to land? Yeah, Karen.
God is making it sound much more tempting than just the land. Like anybody can have the land, but you're getting something even better.
Okay, great. So the fact that God is now saying, don't worry, they have land, but here are all the things that in our connection together you might get in terms of relationship. Karen?
What are those things?
The cities of refuge. Thank you for reminding me.
No. So what are those things? Well, you won't get a portion, blah, 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 but you come to my table and you're going to get.
Right. So I think that what it's saying is that the tribes, yes, you're not going to get a portion of the tribes, right? You're not going to be part of that construct. And then you're also not going to get part of the reward that was taken from these people's land that you took over. But you will have this invitation, for lack of a better term, to be with God at all times, right? You will have the ability to be in God's presence, to eat from God's table, to be with God. Now, the interesting thing that Ramban is doing here, which it makes sense, and it's a little bit harder to buy into and to believe because Ramban is obviously living in a more modern day than the Torah was written in. To eat at God's table is in and of itself a symbol, right? You're not actually going to be eating at God's table. So you have to believe in that relationship with God. God isn't actually providing you, going to the grocery store and providing you with the meal. It just means that you have a relationship with God. But again, the inheritance and the land is so much more physical than anything you will be getting from your relationship with God. So this commentary does not convince me of this being a better deal for Aaron. Any other thoughts on this? There are other commentaries we're going to go to, so if not, we can go to the next one. Okay. So this next one is from Chizkuni, and it's commenting on I am your portion. So ani chelkecha. So this is the end of our verse. God is announcing that God personally is the priest's portion, as opposed to terrestrial earth and in the Holy Land, etc. Seeing that this is so, you are free to perform your duties in the tabernacle once you are all settled in the land of Israel. Seeing that you have these duties, you are relieved of the need to work for a living for 6 days a week and the many difficulties that involves. You need not engage in trade and commerce either. So what Chizkuni is saying here is, I'll take care of you. I, God, will take care of you. You don't have to worry about any kind of human mundane activities because I'm going to be the one who takes care of you, and you'll do what you need to do for the tabernacle and for the temple because that's where I dwell. But in terms of just general human existence, you don't have to worry about that. Thoughts? Yeah, Denise.
Oops. Sorry. I had it in my pocket, so couldn't get to it. Oh my God. And now I lost my thought. Oh, it reminds me a little bit of the idea in Catholicism where the priests don't get married and stuff. And here, like the family of priests is supposed to, like just these things that kind of take you out of everyday mundane life and maybe are intended to be more spiritual or to cultivate more spirituality.
Very interesting. I had not made that connection. The connection that I made, which I guess is like the Jewish version of what you're claiming, is in the Haredi world when the men don't work, they just study all day, and they believe that they will be able to provide for their family and be able to do all the things that they need to do, even though all they're doing is studying all day, which doesn't bring them money. I mean, if you live in Israel, the state gives you a little bit of money for doing that. But that's a very interesting connection. And I wonder, given that we share an Old Testament, I wonder if this is where some of that comes from, actually, that I am your portion, and so you don't need that partnership. Interesting. Okay, Joanna, Renee, and then Tybal.
So I think that there's sort of the very lofty sense of spirituality that, they don't need to be, have possessions in the same way because they're so spiritually connected. But I think there's a very practical sense here also, because to own land, especially in those times, means to have to work the land. And that work requires a lot of time and commitment and dedication. If you think of a farmer's life, how early they're up in the morning, working until it gets dark. Yeah. And it basically, like if you read the Korbanot cycle about how, they started their work when the sun rose and whatever, it coincides. So just like from the practical perspective, it would not have been practical to expect Kohanim or Leviim as well, to own land and to have a job in the Beit HaMikdash, let alone like commuting time back and forth.
Yeah. That's fascinating that maybe God was actually relieving them of what they might think they also had to do, right? It's when you said commuting, it made me think of parsonage, right? That clergy of all different religions get what's called parsonage. I'm not going to go into it because it's annoying to have to explain and also complicated. But basically, back in the day, the community wanted their pastor, because it was created in a Christian-dominated world, wanted their pastor to live near the community, because if someone died or if, they needed to be on call all the time, they had a parsonage home. Now, sometimes you'll see churches that actually have a home attached. That was a parsonage home. In Judaism, in the more traditional denominations, it obviously helps in terms of wanting a home near the community because you would walk on Shabbat. So in terms of that commuting piece, it doesn't help with the example that you gave in terms of actual responsibilities, but it does remind me of you being a shepherd to your flock, right? Not to use such a Christian metaphor, but the idea of being close and really only responsible for that which is your duty as, in this case, the priest or the rabbi or the imam or whatever you are. And God's saying, so don't worry about the other things. You just worry about taking care of your community, being close to me as your God. The other people who don't have those duties will then take care of everything else. I like the practicality of that. I think it's a fascinating point. Renee.
Okay. I'm kind of permished here, so you may have already said it, but I was thinking of like the Dati community also in Israel, where the yeshiva buchers they learn, and it's considered to be a higher kavod, the fact that they're learning dafka for all of us. And then that the women are the ones that are bringing, that they don't need to engage in trade because the women are doing that.
Yeah, I did say that, but it's a good point to reiterate.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. Tybal.
Sorry. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, you're recording. Okay.
You're good.
When you said we share the Old Testament, I will respectfully disagree. Different books, different orders. The Protestant Old Testament is not the same as Eastern Rite Old Testament and Roman Catholic. Different books, different orders. And more importantly, there's different translations. The infamous word in the Hebrew, which means the ritual status of an unmarried woman, is not exactly the same as a virgin. The whole binding of Isaac versus sacrifice of Isaac. I'll stop. I'll just say I think there are 5 really important differences between any Christian version of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, they're definitely different. And obviously we read ours in the original and they read theirs in English. And with any translation comes very different interpretation. So yes, they're definitely different. But I think what I'm getting at is that there are foundational stories and foundational, these same verses from Numbers are also in what they would refer to as the Old Testament, that potentially this comes from. I don't know, because I actually have an Old Testament on my shelf over there. I could look it up, but I don't know. And I do think that it's always interesting to think about when Denise brought up the role of a priest in terms of their own family life, where that could possibly come from. And I don't know that it comes straight from here, but it is interesting that it would make us think of that type of livelihood. So yes, I think we are both correct that they are definitely different, based on translation and interpretation, but also the same verses and same books. Okay. So this is the Or HaChaim. This is now a different commentary, but still on the same part of I am your share and your inheritance, right? God speaking to Aaron and saying, I will be for you everything you need. So God first says, I, meaning that which is unique to God, will be the share of the priests. That's a really interesting statement, right? That it's not just I, the character of God, but that which I can bring to your life that only the divine can bring, right? The qualities, it says here, the what is unique, like the characteristics is the word I was looking for. He then added, amongst the children of Israel, that there would not be anything the Israelites did in which God did not have a share. So now this is a very different read on that we would have a share, that God would be our portion, right? That instead of us being able to just benefit from God, that everything that we do now, God is part of. That's a little bit more big brother than the way that the other rabbis are interpreting the verse. That there would not be anything that the Israelites did in which God did not have a share. So anything that I do, any of my practices, anything that I benefit from, God not only has a hand in, but God also gets a portion of. So it's reciprocal, which is very nice, a little bit harder to believe, and also a fascinating way of thinking about relationship with the divine. The priest would receive this share of the harvest of the land, right? So now what the Or HaChaim is doing is comparing that which the regular human would have in terms of their own relationship with their share of something, with their portion of something, and now comparing it to Aaron and God. The priest would receive this share of the harvest of the land, the trees, the bread, the meat, the wine, the oil, and the remainder of the 24 categories of gifts the Israelite is to donate to the priest on God's behalf. So the verses that we didn't read that I kind of skipped over earlier mentions all these things that the priests now have to deal with as part of the sacrifices to God in their responsibility to the tabernacle. So I would love to hear your thoughts. My understanding of this is that what God is saying is that just as the priest would take the first fruits, would take the first of the animals, provide it as a sacrifice, and be able to benefit from basically the barbecue that happens, right? It says you would eat the meat afterwards. That so too, Aaron with God, that if you do something, God benefits, but also you, Aaron, benefit from that connection to me. So it's a little bit nuanced, but I think that the Or HaChaim is getting to something here that shows reciprocity, which we haven't yet seen from the other commentators. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on this? Or are you lost? Yeah, Elon.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty good racket, if you ask me. They get all the other guys to do the hard work. They do the farming. They do the kill the animals, and these guys get to hang out in the temple and kind of skim a little bit of the profit for themselves. It's actually, originally when you read it, it's like, oh, this kind of sucks because you're not getting any land, but they have a way better deal.
Right. So it seems like they are at the top. I mean, we know they're at the top based on the hierarchy of, where priests are in the line, obviously.
But I would argue that not only are they at the top kind of in a spiritual way, but actually even in an economic way, they're at the top, right?
Exactly.
This is a great gig.
Exactly. That was just what I was about to say. Yeah. It seems like they just have a bunch of people working for them and they get all the benefits of all the work that's being done below them. Yeah. Joanna.
This is taking me to that piece of liturgy that we say on high holidays where we talk about, there's like these repeated lines about our relationship to God, Ki anu amecha. And what's interesting is, I don't know quite what to make of it, but in that piece of liturgy, God is the chelek, but we are nachalatecha. And so, and I believe if I have it right in that, I can flip back in a second and look. Actually, let me check it while I'm talking to you. Yeah, in that, it's still very much a hierarchy that in that line that where we are nachalatecha, God is goralenu, God is our destiny. So clearly there, it's not like all of a sudden we're equal. But it's just interesting to me, like how the phrases are used and what's attributed to whom.
Yeah, that is very interesting, and maybe actually plays with what the Korach is doing here, right? That maybe there is that reciprocity that we can at times be the chelek and we can at times be the nachalatecha, and that God also can be one or the other based on what's happening. Yes, and Ki anu amecha, I've never thought about it as anything other than we are, based on the words, we are your people and you are our portion. But I guess it could also be the reverse, in that you allow us to be your people and therefore we are your portion. That's a beautiful idea. And I would hope that's the case, right? I think if we only believed that God was a man in the sky with a large beard, I think that many of us would be less inclined to enjoy the Judaism that we practice, especially if we're ritual Jews, because then what point is it in me doing anything that God doesn't have any recognition of or get anything in response to my practice, right? And so I do hope that is a little bit of what God feels and God experiences in having a people.
And if you look, as I just did, at all, the second half of all those lines that describe who God is, God can't be that without there being something to be that towards. So there is a reciprocity in that sense that, you can't be a keeper of a vineyard if you don't have a vineyard and if there are no grapes. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful idea. And I think that's what the Korach is doing here, because if God says, I am your share, well, you have to be a people for me to be a share too, right? I can't be your portion if there is nothing to be a portion to. So God needs the people to be devoted to God for God to be able to share that relationship back. Okay, let's look at one last piece here. This is from the Tur HaAruch, which we don't necessarily see very often in this class. And it says, you will not share in the inheritance of their lands. Nachmanides understands the verse to mean that the Levites, the priests, will not share in the land of Israel on the same basis as do the other tribes. In fact, they would not even get any real share, as the 48 cities set aside for the Levites were basically all on soil belonging to the respective tribes on whose territory they were situated. Basically, these cities functioned as cities of refuge for inadvertent killers. That's what the cities of refuge are, a place for people who by accident killed someone or by accident did something wrong. They would go to these cities of refuge so that they weren't punished. The warning spelled out in our verse is actually directed at the priests. The warning to the Levites is only a corollary of this. Our sages interpreted the words Be'artzam lo tinachel as applying primarily to the time when Joshua would divide up the land as the loot, accruing to the people from their war of conquest. So this one is much more about the land, as you just heard, and talking about the land and the territory, and what it means to not have inheritance of that. To me, it's not as compelling of a commentary as the one right before it, just in terms of, I guess, my lack of interest in real estate. But anyone want to say anything about this? I thought I would bring it because it's a very practical way of just reading what it meant to have inheritance of the land. Any thoughts?
Being a Bat Levi.
Yes.
It's interesting that, I mean, after the my understanding is that, like, after the Kohanim, the Levi'im are also pretty important, right?
Yeah, of course.
And but it doesn't seem, based on this paragraph, that the Levi'im are of any special merit at all.
So, well, if you take that and then remember what Elon said, actually the Levites are getting kind of the better deal of the whole thing in terms of their, yes, they are not getting the land, but in terms of their benefits based on their situational responsibilities in the tabernacle. So they were extremely important in terms of the logistics and the spiritual, I don't know what to call it, like responsibility or choreography that they would help figure out. But yeah, I mean, they clearly they weren't the oldest child, right? They weren't getting the inheritance which oldest children got. And so it does go a little bit more into the way which the Torah deals with birth order. But I think Elon's right that they weren't missing out on everything. They just didn't have to do the work for that which they would inherit in terms of the land itself. So I think they're still important. I think they just have different importance. Tybal.
I know it's centuries later, but I wanted to point out in terms of Levine being honored, that the acronym for Siegel is one of, I mean, yes, Cohen is a Cohen Tzaddik, fine, that's simple, but the Siegel acronym, which means something like treasured, I can't remember at the moment, but treasured person that assists the Kohanim, that's beautiful. And to me, given how late Jews took last names, and Siegel is a very common one, that shows that the Levites held a special place in the Jewish heart.
Interesting. Very interesting. I will tell you that my family is made up of Levi'im. In fact, we have Levis in my family on both sides. But my great grandfather, for whatever reason, told people that we were Kohanim, which there's no proof of anywhere. But he told everybody that we were Kohanim, and that my grandfather, so his son, knew of himself as a Kohen. And then my dad, as an adult, decided there's no proof that I'm a Kohen, and I would rather be able to go to funerals and do that mitzvah than hold on to this potential fabrication of our identity. And so we do not hold ourselves as Kohanim. Who knows what we are, but we don't. And so you're right that there are these pieces that, people want to be seen as or hold themselves up to these different status names of Kohen or Levi or Levi, and that who knows if they actually go back and they're actually true. Joanna and then Elon.
It jumped out at me when you were sort of quickly dashing through the verses, and I didn't, raise my hand to comment because I knew it wasn't the focus of our discussion.
Yeah.
But in reaction to what Renee just mentioned about being the daughter of a Levi, it jumped out at me when you read Numbers 18:19 that there is an acknowledgement of the daughters of Levites, right? Because all the sacred gifts are given to you, to your sons, and to your daughters.
Correct.
And, are so often overlooked. It jumped out at me for that reason, the specific mention that, hey, the women get a portion here. Yeah. And it jumped out at me in light of what's coming up in a couple of weeks' time, the story of Benot Tzlofchad, where in the regular population, the daughters have to fight for what's due to them. But there seems to be, for the Levi'im, it was clearly demarcated that the daughters get.
Definitely, for sure. As I was reading it, I was like, oh, I could have picked this verse and talked about the women. But yeah, for sure. And interesting that the daughters of Tzlofchad in 2 weeks, we'll see, are also fighting for land, right? They're fighting for inheritance. So it's also very interesting in terms of this conversation that even if we know that we get something beyond just the inheritance and beyond just the land, that there still is this element of wanting that and feeling like that's the most important aspect of when your parents pass on, receiving that. And so we go back to the original question, which is, how is it important or feel good to Aaron for God to just say, no, I'll be your portion. Don't worry about anything else. Ilan.
Yeah, this is a little bit off topic, but it strikes me that because God basically set the Levi'im up as this kind of bureaucratic class, that it ultimately, in which it historically did ultimately lead to resentment among the other people who are actually farming the fields and, raising the flocks. And not only did it lead to resentment, but in fact, it led to corruption, right? Because you had a whole group of people who actually weren't living by, kind of by the work of the hands, were essentially living off the taxes of the population. It seems to me that whoever wrote the Torah, whether it was divinely inspired or whatever, did not contemplate that this would naturally lead to this resentment and corruption.
Oh, interesting. So what do you think that what do you think that the author thought it was doing then? I
don't think the author contemplated that. I think the author said, okay, we're going to set up these people because somebody's got to do it. But it's kind of the law of unintended consequences. It might have been a good idea to set up a class of people to do this, but the problem is whenever you do that, it invariably leads to the temptation to corruption is kind of just, it's hard to fight, right?
Yeah, and which goes back to, are we reading our own experience, whether with the Torah or just in life, into this verse? Is it so much more basic than we really think? It's a really good point, and I want to think about it more because I'm not sure. To say that God is going to be your portion, I would feel like, especially if God wasn't the author, what's the point in even saying that then? Why not just end the verse before that part? No thoughts on that? It's a very compelling point, Ilan. I know when to ask. I have no idea who I would ask about that, but it's a very interesting, it's an interesting way of reading the Torah always, right? That how are we looking at this as something that the author wrote to either make us think one way, or actually we're now bringing ourselves into this and finding that meaning which they didn't actually intend for. It's very interesting.
And I mean, if you look at the time of Jesus, certainly part of that was a reaction to the perceived corruption of the priests and the Levites, right? Sure. And the people who were in charge of this, right? And the question is, was it set up so that this class of people was doomed because that's human nature? There was nothing to avoid that, right?
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's very, very interesting. Joanna.
I think ultimately what is going on here is something we spent a lot of time actually discussing yesterday on Wednesday in Rabbi Kligfeld's Rashi class, where we were also talking about language that described our relationship with God, and that all of this, like, we have to remember that all of this is metaphor. All of this is indescribable. We can't really talk about God or understand God, because if we fully knew God, then God wouldn't be God. Yeah. And I think in our struggle is the reason that we kind of have some of this repeated language, because we're just trying to get at ways that can help us put our fingers on some way of dealing with the relationship in the only language and terms that we can, because to leave it completely abstract, we wouldn't be able to like function either.
Yeah. I'm just going to leave that. Yeah. Yes, very, very. What did that come up with in terms of where are you with Rabbi Kligfeld that came up? Because you're not this far in the Torah yet.
No, we're just on the cusp of the Exodus in Exodus 4 when God is making his promises to, and describing, the future relationship in essence.
All right. Great. Okay. Exodus 4. Maybe by next year when we get to Exodus, you'll be at like Exodus 7. You'll be able to say, well, look where we are. Tybal.
When Elam was speaking, this isn't specific to it, but what it reminded me of is how sometimes it's so hard to understand the difference in cultural worldviews, even though we're Jewish and we're infused with it. And I always like the example of how the worst thing in the Judaic criminal system would be to take a vow. I mean, to risk being cut off from your people. And you look at the American civil or criminal system, and we rely on sworn testimony from criminals who are making deals. I mean, and the reason why they say that, it's because some of it is so embedded because we're so used to that as Americans. We don't understand what anathema it would be to have witnesses that weren't considered of the highest integrity. And I'm not saying the witness thing is for this specifically, but I think sometimes it's just really hard to have the lens of a different cultural worldview.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Denise.
So I feel like this theme comes up a lot in the Torah, and I think it's true for life, which is that nobody gets every blessing, right? So all through the Torah, you see Yaakov and Rachel had love at first sight, but then they couldn't have children right away, and she died early, and Leah had children really easily, but she didn't have the marriage blessing, and on and on and on. And even Moshe, the greatest of all times, doesn't get to go into Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this is just kind of, it feels like an echo of that, where some people are going to have the blessing of land and wealth and all that comes with it, but they're not going to have the connection in the same way. And some people are going to have the connection, but they're not going to have the land because there's just no having it all in our perspective.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of thinking about something that lacks equality, having equality, right? That you need things to be balanced. You need people to get the blessing. You need people not to get the blessing. And to Elon's point, you need people to do the sacrifices and you need people to benefit from the sacrifices. Right. So you need that balance, or else you also, if we wanted to move this metaphor even further, you need good people and you need bad people, or else the good people would just, so I think that that's a very beautiful way of thinking about this and bringing into it, this idea, this is my own drush, is not what you said, but this idea that God is choosing Aaron and that role of person to be connected to, right? Why not the people who were giving the sacrifices? Why not the people who are higher up in the like Kohanut chain, right? And that's it's a really good underdog drash, because maybe God is actually more connected to the people who are doing the work on the ground rather than, and as Elon said, not necessarily the grunt work, but the work of the connection and the work of the facilitation of those spiritual moments, rather than the people who are so high up that they feel like they don't need that connection. It's a beautiful drash. You should write it. It's a really beautiful connection to this. Okay, Renee and then Joanna, and then I have a 12 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to end a few seconds before 12.
It just got me to think of what we were learning with the Kol Adam Samech.
Yeah, you just muted yourself, but yes.
Oh, you Kol Adam Samech B'chalko.
Yeah. Right. The idea in Pirkei Avot that every person should be happy with their lot, right? Ezehu Ashir hasameach bechalko. Who's the one who's rich? He's happy with everything he has. Yeah, I think, first of all, yes, that is definitely being applied here. And does it mean that God can be everything to you? Because the other piece, we didn't really talk so much about this, but the other piece to this verse is that the author of the Torah is saying, not only you will not get land, but you will get God, which in a certain way assumes that God can be everything. And that's not necessarily the case for everybody. There are not people in this world. Let me say it without double negatives. There are people in this world who feel as though God can be everything for them, and they're set for life. There are other people in this world who need to believe that there's something more than God interacting with their everyday existence to believe that their life is going to be fulfilled in the ways that they need it to be or want it to be. So to go back to the verse, it would the ideal be to have both a little bit of land and the connection to God, or is it enough to have God be your whole portion? Joanna.
Denise, I thought it was kind of profound what you just said, and it made me think of the fact that, what we tend to say is we want things to be equal, but that's not really what we want. We want things to be equitable, right? Yeah. Because you think of yourself as a parent of children, but one example. Do I give exactly the same gift to each of my kids on their birthdays? No, because I have one who's very sports inclined. So I tend to focus on, I recognize him for who he is and focus on that. And I have another kid who's very musical, who wants nothing more for his birthday than, tickets to a musical, which my other son would hate. So it's not always about, does everyone have everything exactly the same and identical, but is it equitable? Is it fair to who that person is and to that person's needs? Yeah. And so it doesn't make sense for everyone to have everything, because it doesn't speak to who everyone is, an understanding and appreciation of individual needs, desires, wants.
Beautiful. I'm reminded of during the summer when all of the protests were happening everywhere, but also in the streets of Los Angeles. And there was a meme that went out that had 3 different people. One was a child, one was an adult, and one was like a person older in age. And you saw they were different heights in the picture. Some of you probably saw this, and if I'm not explaining it well, you might not know what I'm talking about, but they were each different heights. And so one photo had a fence and boxes on the bottom, and the boxes were the same height. And each person, the child, the father, the grandfather, were standing on these boxes. The child couldn't see over the fence. The father could see over the fence. And the grandfather was not comfortable, getting up on that box. So then the second photo has the drawing, of the boxes at different heights, so that the child could then see over the fence, and the father had the same height boxes before because that worked for him, and the grandfather had steps up to the box so that he could see over the fence, right? And what that shows is that exactly the example that you just gave, that you can't just have everybody getting the same experience, getting the same gift, getting the same amount of land, right? If we're going to go back to our Torah, but that which you need is that which you should receive to be able to feel like you're part of the same experience. So yeah, you did a much more beautiful job with this verse than I could have ever imagined. I would not have gone to these places. It's part of the beauty of this class. But I hope that you're able to think about the different ways in which we fall into this, right? Where is our trajectory in terms of us feeling like we have a portion, both in terms of that which we have tangibly, but also in terms of, guys, thank you. This is very nice. I didn't mean to ask all these compliments. But in terms of the way in which we also feel like we have part of a relationship with God to help us through navigating these, the different elements of the portion that we have in this life. Shabbat Shalom. I hope this was a different view of Korach than you've usually had before. Definitely not the main part of this Parsha in terms of the story. And hope to see many of you, whether in person or online tomorrow for Shabbat services.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.